Hey everyone, this is Josh Justice, aka Coding It Wrong. On a side project I was just working on, I ran into a really interesting situation doing some challenging React component unit testing. And I wanted to take the opportunity to record it and the thought process I went through as an illustration of how you can tackle the really tricky testing problems. Let's take a look at the application that I was working on. It is the traditional to-do list application. Believe it or not, I'm really writing a to-do list application to really be used by myself because I'm just so addicted to to-dos that I want it to be exactly the way I want it. I've got a Cypress test running here for the basic functionality of the app. And when I run through it, you can see that I added to do. Well, maybe you can't see because it's so fast, but I added to do and complete it, and I added to do and delete it as well as a separate action. So I have the to-do form at the top and the to-do list going down there as items are added in and removed from it. So pretty straightforward. The interesting and unique thing about this application is the data layer I'm using is something unique, Orbit.js. Let me pull it up here to show it to you. So Orbit.js is a data layer that works with the JSON API standard. It has a lot of functionality for offline and for automatic data synchronization that I'm really excited about. So I'm going to be able to use Orbit to just add to-dos to my app, even if I'm not connected to the network. I'm going to have a web application version that's a PWA and a React Native app version as well. I'll be able to add to-dos even if I'm offline, and then when I come back online later, Orbit will automatically synchronize them up. It's stored the operations, it's queued them up that need to run once you're on the server. So that's some really cool functionality you get out of the box, and it's enabled by the JSON API standard that allows things to work in a standard way. So I'm pretty excited to work with Orbit. Instead of using a React integration, I've decided to kind of write my own integration with it. It's a standard JavaScript library. And so the way I connected it is using this container component here. I'm using hooks, and so just to walk you through what's going on briefly, this is a component that takes a render prop, and it's going to handle running the query for me. And it's just a few lines, but there's some complexity there. So what happens is I start out with some state, a set of records that is just an empty array to begin. And skipping this effect for a moment, we're going to render out the call the render prop, and we're going to pass the records into it. Pretty straightforward. So what happens in the use effect here? Well, here's what happens. We're taking in a store, an Orbit.js in-memory store here, and we set up an event listener. We say anytime a transformation happens on the store, so anytime records change, I want to update the records in my component. I'm calling store.cache.query to get the records that are currently in the store. And I pass in the query that the user provides. It's a function that a user can use to specify certain model types, certain criteria, and sorting and things like that. So basically, whenever the store changes, we're going to update the state in my React component, and that's going to trigger a re-render, of course. The other thing I do in the use effect is I call a function here, store ready, that's going to ask if the store has been loaded up and booted up and is ready for me to interact with. It returns a promise, and so when it resolves, then I'm going to call store.query. So the difference between store.query and store.cache.query is store.query actually executes the operation, which in our case, because we're connected to a remote API, is going to actually run a request to load the data. In my case, I'm just getting a list of all the to-dos. It's pretty straightforward. So this operation makes the request to the server, and then when the data is loaded, it's returned, and it's stored in Orbit.js's store, this action, transform, is going to happen. It says a transformation event has happened on the store, something has changed, and so as a result of the records changing from this coming in, we're going to get the records out of the cache, out of the local cache that's in memory, and set them into the React component state. This is also going to work as we add records later. That's going to trigger a store transform event as well because a new record has been added, deletions and things like that. That all happens. So really, this just allows us to update the component state anytime the Orbit store changes. And that's what gives us our reactivity that's going to cause our component to re-render. And we can see that happening. Just to run the Cypress test again, we run through. And my tests actually right now are not initially loading the data from remote. That's not happening as part of the test. But it is showing that as I add a to-do, it is added, and as I complete and delete a to-do, it's deleted. So our Cypress test is showing that this is all working. It's all working together. So this is actually fine. This covers my functionality to prove that it's working. You don't have to do it in a Cypress test. You can do an integration test as well that runs the test query container against a real Orbit store and a real render prop to make sure that things are rendered out properly. But I think the Cypress test gives us that integration testing properly to make sure that it is actually interacting with Orbit in the way we expect. So why do I want to unit test it? Well, this is some pretty complex stuff. I'm new to Orbit, and so I really think I want to define the interface of like what is happening when. So Cypress shows us that eventually the data is going to show up on the screen and stuff like that, and Cypress's automatic waiting helps us out. But I want to see what happens when, and really step down at a low level at each point along the component's lifecycle and being used. What is happening? What calls are being sent? What data is being used, and stuff like that. So I want to use unit tests to really give me visibility into that. One of the reasons I want to do this actually is I'm thinking of refactoring this component into a React custom hook. I haven't done that before, and so I'm going to need some help to make sure I get that working. And so by adding a test around the query container component, I'm going to be able to define all the scenarios for how I want the query functionality to work. And then when I replace it with a hook, probably by keeping the query container component and then using my custom hook inside it, that's going to allow me to extract a hook with greater confidence that not only is my app working as far as what's visible to the user, but all the details of what happens when is still happening right. Orbit is a third-party library, and I need to interact with it in the way that it expects, and so a unit test is going to help me define that. So one of the reasons I wanted to illustrate this is I'm a big fan of test-driven development and writing the test before I write the code. But one of the cases that a lot of folks say that they don't test drive is when they're like, I don't know how the functionality needs to work. I need to play with it to get it working first before I even have confidence. And that's definitely the case here. I'm new enough to Orbit that I would not have been able to write this just from scratch, certainly not know how to test drive it to make it happening, and even think through the sequence of what I wanted to test drive. So I really needed to build out the component first and get it working before I could write tests. So I have a few options now. I could keep it without unit tests, and I do have Cypress tests covering it. Or I could write the tests after the fact to try to document things. And I actually tried that. I tried writing the tests after the fact, but as I did that, I realized I had low confidence that I was going to fully cover it. I saw myself drifting towards just testing the happy path and skipping things like what happens if store ready is not yet resolved, what happens in that scenario. It's very easy when writing tests after the fact to only test the happy path. And then you need a code coverage tool to tell you the lines and the conditions that you've missed. And those aren't always fully accurate. Sometimes they can lead you to overly coupling your code. So instead, what I'd recommend is treating this code as a spike. So we've built this, it's not tested. We're going to re-implement it using test-driven development to make sure that we're only writing the lines of code that the tests drive us to. Now, we are going to reference our spike pretty much in detail at this point to remember what we're looking for. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this functionality over here. I'm going to comment it and say spike. So we're going to reference it, but not to see what code we need to copy over exactly, but instead to see what conditions, what functionality we need to think about in the test. The other caveat I need to make is that I didn't test drive this out from the first place. Hopefully, as I screencast this, it's going to be pretty clear what's happening, but experimentation was needed. I had to really sit and think through what is my component doing and when. And I think that's a really good takeaway, that I've learned more about how this component's lifecycle and sequence works, which I think is really good. But just so you know, this is not illustrating what I was able to do off the cuff testing this component. This is after a round of thinking through it, and I am going to actually reference the test code that came out of that first set. So really, this is a three-step process. Spike it, and then test after, and now I'm coming back through to test drive it. But with that said, let's go through it, and I hope this will be interesting to think about how to test a kind of complex component like this. So we have our query container test here. It's a just test using React testing library. We're getting the warning here that the test suite failed to run. So let's get just a empty test working to get that passing. Yeah, it works, so that's fine. So now we need to actually test our query container component. So what are the different situations or scenarios that we want to test for? So there's a lot of things happening. When the component first renders, we use the effect to wait for this promise to resolve and then kick off this store.query, and we expect this transform event to come back afterwards. So I think the first thing that I want to test through is just what happens in the case when the component is first rendered and when the store is not ready. So that'll be the easiest, simplest situation. So let's write that out here. We'll say describe when store is not ready. And so what does it do? So when the store is not ready, this doesn't run, and so therefore this doesn't run. So the use effect doesn't really do much. So really what happens is we end up calling our render prop with the records that we've been given, That's rendered, and then what we are given back from the render prop, we render back out. And so we want to test that. We want to test both aspects of that. So we'll say it calls the render prop with an empty record set. So we want to know that it starts out with an empty array. And I'll go ahead and write out the other case we described. I think I can say it.skip renders the result of the render prop. Let's see if I run this. Missing second argument. Well, let me just do this even though it's skipped for now. Yeah, okay, so that is now there. And you'll see as we go why I actually want to test both sides of this, and just instead of the fact that the render prop was called or the fact that the right thing was rendered. We're going to see as we let this test drive our code that it's going to help us make sure we're doing everything we need to do. Oh, the other thing I should do is go ahead and clear out my component here. I'll just take an empty object there, and we'll just return null. Oops. We're getting an ESLint warning, so why don't we just clear it out? So it really is just an empty function. Our test is passing because we're not actually forcing anything to happen yet, so let's force something to happen. Okay, query container should call the render prop with an empty record set when we start out. So we're going to use React testing library's render method. We're going to call query container. We're going to pass it a render prop, and we'll call it render prop. And that's going to need to be a just mock function because we want to assert what it's called with. I am going to go ahead and give it a mock name, I think is the right way to do that. Yeah, because we're going to have a few different mock functions, so having a name is going to be the most helpful. So we render the render prop, and then we're going to say, let me add a line break here. Expect render prop to have been called with the empty array. All right, so let's save this. I expect that it's going to say that render prop was not called. Yep, expected to be called with empty array, but number of calls was 0. Cool, so let's implement that. We've got our red test now, where it's some functionality is failed because the functionality is not there. So now we'll write the minimal code to get this passing. We don't want to write all of what's in our component now because we want our test to drive us there. So we're going to say, take in a render prop here, and we're going to call render. I'm going to call it without any arguments real quick just to see the error. Now we're going to say that it was expected to have been called with an empty array, but it was called with no arguments. Yep, expected called with an empty array, but it was actually called with 0 arguments. So I'm going to pass an empty array. And again, we know that this is ultimately going to be React component state, but we want our test to drive us there, to force us to the point where we need component state. So I update this to call render with the empty array, save, and then it succeeds. All right, so this is working now. We are calling the render prop with an empty record set properly. You can see that this isn't enough though, because we're not returning the results, we're just returning null. So we want to test to confirm that whatever the render prop renders is what our query container actually returns as well. So let's write this down here. This test, it renders the result of the render prop. So in this case, I am going to copy over this. I'm going to keep this render prop mock here, and then mock return value. Now what I'm going to do is, I was thinking through this earlier, I want it to actually be JSX, so it's actually a component really doing a thing, but I just want something very simple. So we'll just do a div here, and we'll just have the text render prop return. Okay. So now coming out of this render method from 2 different render methods here. This is React testing library's render function that's rendering a component. We want to destructure the results to get something out. And we want, let's see here, it's query by text. And then we say expect query by text render prop return not to be null. So we want this text that's rendered out by the render prop to be returned and rendered out by our query container component itself. So let's run this and see if it succeeds. It should fail because nothing's rendered. Yeah, expected receive not to be null, but it was null. So render prop return was not found. So let's now return that. We just return the rendered value instead of returning null, and I expect that now our test will pass. Oh, something is wrong here. What have I done? Nothing was returned from render. It usually means a return statement is missing. Well, interesting. I don't know why that is, because it's done. Mock return value. Let me look at my cheater code over here to see. Mock return value. Render prop return. Query by text. Render prop return not to be null. Yeah, this was working before. All right, well, let's look through this and see what we can figure out. Nothing was returned from render. Return statement is missing. Yeah, I mean, return from render. Well, let me, just to experiment with this, make sure our test framework is working. Let's, oh, check it out. React must be in scope when using JSX. That's just a temporary thing now. But so let's just see if we're able to render even something hard-coded here. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So something is returned. So if we said query by text hi, and now we got the function call test erroring out. Let's just do that to see that one passing as well. Okay, so that's passing. So let's assign this to a variable. Render result, return render result. Don't need, let me comment out React because we might need it again a bit later. So this is getting this interesting error. Well, this is a good lesson on how to kind of troubleshoot this. Nothing was returned from render. So let's log out the render result. React element. Yeah, that should be coming back. Prop just function mock return value. Render prop return. Huh. Well, I may edit this out in the final video to kind of get this going a bit faster. Yeah, I mean, query by text not to be null. This is the code that we had before. Oh, you know what? This could be, oh, you know what's happening? It's the other test. Check it out. It calls the render prop with an empty record set. Renders the result as succeeding, but this other test is failing. All right, so let's get this one fixed as well. We need to just copy over the return value on here, because before we weren't using the result of the render prop, but now we are. So we paste that in, give it an actual value, and now that test is passing as well. So that's great. So we can remove this, remove this. We can go ahead and do a refactor and just return without having a temporary value. And now we're good. So now let's go back and think about these two different tests. We're confirming that we call the render prop with an empty record set, and we renders the result of the render prop. And so we saw that when we only tested calling the render prop, then it wasn't enough because we weren't returning the value. So what if we just tested the rendered result? What if we could just do that? So let's skip this test and say, well, yeah, whatever happens in the call there, as long as we just pass back the result, we should be fine. The problem here is that we're no longer testing what's passed to the render prop. So we could pass bad things here, and the test is still going to pass. So in our case, we care about what we're passing along. We care about the outgoing properties passed to our render prop, as well as what's returned out of our component. And so, if we put our test back in here, then that's going to fail because we're passing the wrong things. But then if we put the empty array that we're passing there, it's going to pass again. So we're testing the interface of our component, and because it's a unit test, it's very low level. So it's all the rendered results coming out of our component, as well as the props passed to child components and other functions. So we're really testing the query container in isolation and testing what's going out and coming in, kind of both sides of its communication paths. So that's why we need both tests. Let's go ahead and do some refactoring here to remove this duplication. We'll create a before each here. And we're going to, I think our render prop can just kind of come up here. I think it can be a constant. It's not set up in there. We will set up a, well, let me do one thing at a time. Pull out the render prop and make sure that still succeeds. And it does. Now let's see, the rendering happens twice. So let's pull that out, and we need query by text. I'm going to put that up here for reasons that'll become obvious later. So we're going to have a query by text in our before each. We're going to render, assign a query by text, and we do that thing where this is when you're destructuring without a const or a let in front of it. You have to put it in parentheses. I forget exactly why. It's a JavaScript syntax thing. And now we don't need either of these renders. We just have like single line expectations in there. Let's run it. Yes, so when the store is not ready and the before each defines our action for what we're doing, and then we have our two individual expectations. We expect the render prop was called, and we expect that the correct returned value from the render prop was rendered out. Cool. So this, I think, covers the state when the store is not ready. We may come back and do something else. But let's go ahead and move on now to describe when store is ready. And the fact that the store is not ready is not something that's come into our application code yet, but let's compare over here. So what differs? So we're already we're already covering the rendering, not the state yet. We don't need the state. But again, the fact that we're thinking about testing by the contract, it is very tempting to say, how can I test to make sure that this use state line is in here? How do I test this line of code? And I think that's really the wrong way to think. Instead, we want to think about the external behavior of the functionality and say, what do I need it to do? Just what do I need it to do? And even setting aside whether we use state or not. Maybe in test driving it, we'll find that we don't need the state after all. So we'll ignore this line for now and just focus on what are the different scenarios that we want to be testing. So what's different when the store is ready? Well, when the store is not ready, then this code is not called. But when the store is ready, then this code is called, and the store.query function or method is called, passing in the query that was passed to us. Now this is all that's going to happen for now, because it's later when the store has a transform event that will come back and execute this line of code. So for right now, we just want to test what happens when store ready returns. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to say here and what is the phrase? I've been looking at the code. It calls store.query with the passed in query. Calls store.query. All right, well, let's not even phrase it that way. It's like runs the passed in query against the store. Yeah, so when the store is ready, we run the passed in query against the store. So let's figure this out. I want to write a render first, query container. We're going to need store ready, which is going to be a function. Let's call it store ready. We're going to need the store itself, and that's going to happen there. That's what's passed in. And before I even define store ready and store, let me just go ahead and write the expectation. Expect store.query. Oh, I need to pass in the query as well. And because the word query is used multiple places here, I'm going to call this user query. So it's the query from the parent component that is being passed in. Maybe I'll call it query prop. Let's call it user query to indicate this is not something internal to Orbit.js. This is something provided by the user, or really the developer of the application. So store.query expected to have been called with user query. Now we're going to get a bunch of linting errors, and I'm sure the test will tell us problems as well. The things are not defined. Or maybe not. Yes, store ready is not defined. Okay, cool. So we need to define these. Store ready. And let's really just go one error at a time, and we'll just define this to null, and we'll just make it something else when the test tells us that it needs to be something else. Okay, store is not defined, and let's go ahead and define okay, next, render is not a function, so we need to pass in a render function here. And so what I think I'm going to do that, well, to be safe for now, I'm going to copy over this render prop, and probably we're going to be able to just remove that duplication later. So now it cannot read property query of null. So can't even run our assertion because store is not an object that has a query property. It's just a null. So let's make it an object, a query property, and we'll just make that null and see what happens next. Now it says So expected receive to have been called with expected. Receive value must be a mock or spy function. The store query, we do want it to be just mock, because we're going to want to inspect it later. So expected just function to have been called with expected user query. Yeah, expected to have been called with null. So that's not that descriptive. We want user query to be more descriptive. Now our application doesn't really need this actually to be a function. If you look at our final code, it's just something that's passed along. But in this case, I feel like a little bit of realism. So I'm going to make it a function, and we'll say this is like user query function, just so you can kind of see it readability wise there. Yeah, here we go. So expected just function to have been called with function user query, but it had 0 calls. Oh, this reminds me, just function here. I do want to do a mock name here. We'll just call it store.query. That'll be a little bit more descriptive. Expected store query to have been called with the function user query, but it was not called at all. Cool, so now here's our error. The other thing though is, this is the scenario where we say when the store is ready. And store ready right now is not doing anything. So what I want to do, let's see here. Yeah, let's do this. Okay, so we want store ready in our application is a function that returns a promise. So let's make it a function. It returns a promise. And now in the promise, this I would not have remembered off the top of my head. I had to look this up when I was getting the error message before. But a promise takes a callback or handler, or whatever you call it, and takes a resolve and a reject. We just need the resolve here. And what we're going to do is to save this. We'll say, make a variable here, const, actually it's let, resolve store ready. We'll say resolve store ready equals resolve. Okay, Prettier is going to format that for us. So we assign this here. So resolve store ready is now ready. This is now a function we can call to resolve the promise, to let it know that the store is ready. And we need to do this to test this scenario. So this is defining the interface of our function, and that's why it's in the test. This is a situation where we have a query container that all this stuff happens, and then afterwards, after it's rendered, we resolve that the store is now ready, and then now the store query should be called with user query. Yes, there's a kind of an edge case here. Test-driven development, really experienced people might do this differently, but that's okay. Okay, so this all runs. Oh, resolve store ready is not a function. That's surprising. New promise resolve. Oh, so this is because I guess store ready is not actually being called. So I'm going to just define this to be an empty function for now, just so our test doesn't fail in that way before we can get to the code. So now we're in this situation where store ready is being passed in. We have the ability to control it to resolve it. And so we are rendering the component and then resolving store ready. And then we're checking to see if the query was called, but it was not. So now we're set here. So this says expect store query to have been called with this. So what's the simplest code we can pass to do this is to actually call it. So we're going to take the store function here, do store.query. We're going to call store.query. So we save this, we run it. We cannot read property query of undefined, but this I think is in a different test. This is when the store is not ready. So let's fix that test. Is that the right way to do it? Yeah. Maybe this could have been done cleaner, but I'm going to do it this way for now. No, I don't really like this. Let's just run only this one test for now. We'll come back and fix them later. So we're running only our one test here. We expected it to be called with the function user query, and it was called with 0 arguments. So this is the query. Query is the name of the prop that we take in. And so we're calling store query with the query prop. That should now solve this test, and our test should pass. So this is passing. When the store is ready, it runs the passing query against the store. So that's good. But one of the things you may have noticed is we're not actually checking that the store ready is resolved or not. And so there's maybe more rigid ways to do this, but the way I can think to do this is to actually add another case back here when the store is not ready, to say it does not run the passed in query against the store. So we want to assert that that doesn't happen in that scenario. So let's copy over some stuff here. Really, we could copy over the assertion, if nothing else. Expect store query not to have been called. And we don't care what it's called with or not. We want it to not be called. So we need a store, and it is going to need a query function. So let's put this up here. And I think we might need this in the before each. Let's run it and see if it works. I think we can add an only here, so it also runs this one other test. What does it say? Cannot read property query of undefined. I think it's because we're not passing in the store. Oh, I ran the wrong test. It does not run the passing query against the store. Okay, so here we go. In this case, we expect store query not to have been called, but it was called one time because it's not conditional based on the store ready function. So now we can pass that over there. And let's do it this way. We could say store ready equals a function, and we're going to say mock promise that does not resolve. And we're going to say it has a then, but the then does nothing. There's just no time that the callback past the then is called, and we're fine. And we return mock promise that does not resolve. So because this is a bit indirect, I gave this a local variable so that we can understand the point of this object is a mock promise that does not resolve. And then we're going to pass store ready into here. So I expect that now both of our tests are going to pass because this. Oh well, no, it's not. This is not yet. We have not yet implemented the functionality. I guess I should have put the functionality in there first. But now that we're passing a store ready in both cases, what we can say, and I'll compare with my production code, we do store ready then store query. So I'm going to do this. So instead of always running store query, we do store ready then. So if and when store ready resolves, then run the store query. And I expect both of our tests to pass now. No. Okay. Store ready, then store query. When store is ready, let's see here. So our first test, not running the passing query, succeeded. But then when store is ready, it says expected to have been called. Now, is that... Let's find out here. I'm going to check against my code. This is a bit surprising. This is not what I expected. So I wonder why. I wonder if anything differs with my code that was working properly. Resolve store ready. I don't think it's a timing issue because I think this is synchronous. Let's take a look through here. Down to here. Resolve store ready. Let me actually not set a default value in here to make sure that it actually is being assigned. Yeah, so that's fine. It's just still failing. So we render and then we resolve store ready. So let's just do a logging statement here. Store ready resolved. So let's see if this is outputted for us. So store ready resolved happens after the fact here. So I think it's a timing issue. I think this is, I guess it does run somewhere else on the run loop or something like that. Resolve store ready. Can I make that a promise that I return? I set up my code because I didn't test drive it before. It was set up slightly differently. I don't think resolve is going to work. So this is interesting. Asynchronous code like this is a challenge. I could change it to be just like my test code that I ran before, but that's not going to solve the root of the problem, and I wouldn't have done it except that I had done it this way already. Solve store ready. Store query to have been called. Let me just output store here to make sure store is what we expect. Yeah, store, and there's store query. But it was just not called. Yeah. Let's look it up. There's some timers. We can Google this. See if just how to wait for promise resolution queue. Test a function as a promise. Testing asynchronous code. Promises. You know, yeah, maybe, Yeah, maybe with this promise. Yeah, I think I can do that actually. So let's say store ready promise. I'll pull this out to here. So this is now a function that returns store ready promise. So we now have access to our store ready promise. And so we want to return that, so Jest won't finish the test until that promise resolves. And again, we are resolving it here, but it's not going to finish running until all the checks happen. So this should hopefully make Jest wait. So let's run it to see, and it does. Okay, so I want to see things break in the test setup we have. So let me just add another test here. Expect true to be false to make sure that we're actually getting to this point. And if an expectation in here fails, that the test does fail. So let's see. It does. Okay, so this means that this expectation is actually being run and it succeeds. And we can also break the real production code by commenting this out and see that our one test passes where it doesn't run, but here where it's supposed to run when the store is ready, it did not, it's confirming that our real code is in there. So let's just refactor our code a bit to simplify it or remove an unnecessary line break. Yeah, so now it's passing. So one kind of meta point here is, I mean, if you were really an expert at JavaScript promises, maybe it would have been obvious to you going through here that you need to set up the test this way. But you don't need to be an expert at JavaScript promises to know this in advance as you go. You just need to be familiar with the way these JavaScript and browser APIs work and have some facilities with tests to know what to do. But doing test-driven development lets you focus on one thing at a time. If I had written my entire test suite and this was failing, it would have been hard to focus. But because this was the individual test, and it was succeeding before and now failing, I had a sense that it had to do with asynchrony. One of the benefits of test-driven development is that it makes sure you really have control over your code. You know what's happening when. And so it lets you really focus, take small steps, and really ratchet things forward a tiny bit at a time so that you're really knowing that your code is doing exactly what you want. So now good. We've got it. We found that we needed an expectation here that we don't run the passed-in query when the store is not ready, but then when the store is ready, we do run it. So let's take off these onlys to run our other tests now to see if we've broken anything. At least the way I do test-driven development, that happens. And we see that it's succeeding now. It's because to get this run, we had to pass in the props that were necessary here, we began to be necessary, that were causing the other tests to fail. So cool, we're now asserting what is rendered here when the store is not ready and what was rendered when it is ready. If you wanted to fully cover everything, you could add test cases in here that say when the store is ready, the render prop is called and the results are rendered. I don't think we really need to do that. I think our first test covers it and we're good to go. But you could add those for extra safety if you wanted to. Those would just not necessarily be test-driven development because it's other conditions that are covering the functionality that's already there in the code. But that's okay in that case. I think I'm fine with that. So what else do we need to happen here? We're rendering this empty array. And then when the store is ready, we're calling store.query. And because store.query is a mock function, nothing else is happening from there. Because we don't want to re-implement Orbit.js as a part of our test, we're just documenting what is the outgoing message sent to this other system. So what else is needed in our production code? Well, seeing from our spike, we need to look for the store transform event and update the records to cause a re-render. And that does seem like it's going to in fact require a state to be used, but we'll get there shortly. So really the condition that we're describing here is, and you could say when the store transform happens, but conceptually I want to say when the store query returns. That's the situation we're describing. And we're going to control our code to get the store query to return. So what happens then? It renders records from the store. Renders records from the store. Great. So whereas before we were confirming that we're calling the render prop with an empty record set, now we want to call it with the records from the store. And in fact, I'm going to rename that. Calls the render prop with the records from the store. So that's what's going to happen. We call the render prop there because of our existing code that those new results are going to be returned back afterwards. So this should be good for us. So let's just kind of copy over our basics here. Query container. We'll take the props out for now and just see what we need. Calls the render prop with the records from the store. So we are going to need the render prop. And we're going to say expect render prop to have been called with, and we're going to have some kind of store records variable. So what's store records? Store records, it just needs to be something. I'm going to say sort of an object with foo bar. The details don't matter to this component. And we do need a render prop. So let's copy that over. I forgot to kind of refactor to remove duplication between those two scenarios. So we'll do that afterwards after all of our tests are in. But we'll get a render prop here. So let's see what's happening in our test. Store ready is not a function. So store ready is needed. I think we want a store ready to work like this. So there's going to be a lot of duplication here. Store ready, because we do want this to happen after the store ready happens. I'm going to go ahead and copy this over this setup because I'm pretty sure we're going to need this asynchrony here to make sure the test runs properly. And we are, so we render a component, we do still want to resolve store ready again. So we need to be in the state where that's resolved. Maybe for the sake of the code, the actual code itself, that's not needed. Maybe you could it might even make sense, honestly, to wait for the store to be ready before you even set up that transform there. So that's interesting. Actually, I think I'm going to code the code slightly differently here, but I think we do need to do this. I don't think we need to test the case where the store query returns, but the store is not ready yet. That shouldn't happen because we shouldn't be doing the query. So I think we're going to call resolve store ready there. Oh, here we go. What happened here? Okay. Unhandled promise rejection. I'm not sure what that's from. We'll come back to that. The other code we do might resolve that, but the test failure is, oh, here we go. Can I read property query of undefined? We are getting a test failure, but like this, let's fix this error as well. We need a store with a query. Store equals store. So that did resolve the other error, so that's nice. And now what we're getting here is just that it was rendered, and the render happened with the empty array instead of with the return values. So there is not yet any way for us to provide these store records anywhere. I'm going to put this at the top so I can see it. So how are we supposed to be providing these store records? Well, let's look at the production code. Store records are supposed to be coming back from store.cache.query. So let's provide them in there. So store.cache is now an object, and it has a query. So store query and store cache query. This is synchronous because it's coming out of the cache, and we just return the store records. So that should be needed. I expect that our test is not going to change because the store cache query is not being used at all. So let's see that happen. Yep, it still doesn't. So how is store cache query supposed to be called? It's only supposed to be called on store transform, store on transform. So what's the right way to do this? This again may not be strict test-driven development, but I am going to put this code in, and I think our test is going to fail because we need some kind of plumbing in the test and hook this all up. So I'm going to copy this over and say, we need to store on transform. We also need to set up the state. Oh, the other interesting thing is this store ready was not happening in a use effect. So it's actually called multiple times. So you could write a test if you wanted to ensure that store ready and store query is only called once when the component mounts. I don't feel the need to do that. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this test we're working on back on hold so we can get back to green. And then I'm going to refactor the code to add use effect. Again, it's probably more strict TDD to write a test that drives me to have use effect here, but this is conventional enough React that I'm okay with it. Const use effect. Wait. Let's see if I'm not remembering this. Okay, so now in use effect, that's what we want to call store ready, then store query. For some reason, my linter is not running to tell me. I think we're in the test here. We're going to get, oh, we're not. Interesting. The linter is not telling me I need to put my dependencies in here, but I'm going to go ahead and do that. Store ready, store, and query are all dependencies. And I expect in normal use that none of these would change, but those are dependencies of the use effect. All my tests are still passing, which means that me putting this in this use effect doesn't break anything. It restricts when it's run, and so if that makes you uncomfortable, you could write a test for that. But probably I'm more zealous for TDD than many of y'all, so I will say that adding use effect here is safe. So let's go back to our new test here that's not yet passing when the store query returns. So we need to provide these store records. And now if we compare our code and our spike code, we have use effect, store ready, and then it's in the store on transform that we're setting the records. So I think it's clear at this point that we do need to use state. We want reactivity where at first we have the empty array, and then afterwards the records that come back from here are going to be rendered in. So that's enough clarity for me to see clear that we need a use state, and so I'm comfortable writing a little bit of code to handle that. So actually, for that purpose, I'm going to actually put this on hold again. I'm going to skip our test. And I wouldn't always do this in real production use, but for safety, I would. So we're going to add use state here and just make sure we're refactoring to use state. Even though we won't be changing the state at this point, this just confirms we can make this change without breaking anything. I would say records, set records, defaulted to the empty array, and then we render records. Alright, ESLint, we're going to need set records in a minute. So now that we've refactored to have state there, that's not yet used, but our tests are still passing. So now one more time, we can turn this test back on, and now we can compare with our spike. So as expected, we still don't have our new state being used, but we're now much closer. We can do what we want to do here, store on transform, set records, and then we say store cache query. So we're executing the query here, and then when the store is transformed or changed as a result of that, we're going to set the records. Incidentally, I just realized that my test isn't actually handling the case where, well, it's just saying any reason that transforms it. No, but the test is going to handle that as well. I may rename the test to more accurately describe that, so we'll see what happens. But so let's save this here. I expect that I'm going to get some failures related to me not having all this stuff wired up in the mock objects in my test. So let's save it and run it. So now we get an error. The error is store.on is not a function. So let's fix these errors one at a time. We'll say on. Now store.on is a function. This will not be enough, but we'll just rerun and see what happens. Oh, we have a bunch of tests failing. So let's just focus on our one test we're working on, and then we'll fix the others after we get this one working. Yeah, so store.on is called, but then nothing's happening because store.on doesn't do anything. We're never, our code, our test infrastructure code is never calling this thing. So let's think about this. Was tricky for me when I was thinking about this because this is really indirect, and when you're writing tests afterwards, it's hard to think about this. So let's think about it together now. What our code is doing is calling store.on to set up an event handler. Then Orbit.js's code at some point calls my event handler at the appropriate time, and then we're back into my code that sets these records. So in our test, we need to track this event handler that our production code provided, and then call it ourselves from within the test. This is a case where our test is not trying to reproduce all of what Orbit does, but we want to define the contract of what Orbit is doing and when. And so I'm going to need to look at my sample code to see how I might do this. So, sorry, I just get my brain a second here to think about it. Transform, so the transform handler. So we want a transform handler here. And in on, the on function takes a event name and handler, event name, handler, and then what we want to do in here is store that. So we're saving the production code handler that's passed in, and it's accessible from our test. And this will allow us to execute it as though it's a Orbit event happening. It allows us to execute it. So let's call that down here. Handler, and just for clarity, I'll say simulate Orbit executing a transform event. So this little comment just shows what we're doing. So now I think our code will get, this production code will get hit because this is what's passed. And I think we're going to get some other errors due to some infrastructure not being set up. So here we go. Warning, an update to query container inside a test was not wrapped in act. When testing, code that causes React state updates should be wrapped into act. So when React hooks first came out, you used to get this a lot whenever you're trying to test code that was using hooks and use effect and things like that. So my brain can't quite handle all the details of that, but some of it should have been able to be handled by React and by the test tooling working together. And so they have worked that out. I forget what side it was worked out on, where that is now happening automatically. But when we're doing something in our code here, where we're running something from within our test code that causes a re-render or causes state updates, really, specifically, it should be wrapped in act. And so we do need to manually do this. Act is provided by React Testing Library, just kind of re-export it. And so we can say act here. And so this just lets React know that state updates are going to be happening in here and appropriate things happen behind the scenes. That's the extent of my level of understanding of all that. If you know more, post in the comments and let us know. There's a super long thread in GitHub issues that describes it, but let's do this. This should get us past that error. And it's succeeding. So it's actually, it is being called, the render prop has been called with the store record. So because we had to do this a bit indirectly, let me break that again and just make sure that happens. Actually, I'm surprised store cache query. Let's just see what happens if it's not run at all. So that is never done. Now what if we do set records to do something else that's like something else? Does our test catch that the wrong data is being rendered out? It does. Yeah, so something else is wrong. It should have been foobar. So where do we get foobar? Well, we get foobar from store cache query. And so as long as we're calling set records with store cache query, we're good. Now notice that in this case, we didn't need to make an assertion that store cache query was called, because in this case, that was something that our test, that we just needed to wire it up to return the appropriate records synchronously. And so but the fact that these store records make it through to be called, to pass to the render prop is sufficient. We don't need to test that store cache query was called with certain arguments. Although, now that I think about it, we do want to check that the query is passed in, because watch this. If I remove query there, then our test is still going to pass, and that's not okay. Store cache query, the cache data is the result of a specific query that was passed in from the user. So we need a test to drive the fact that the query was passed in there. And so let me look at this. Yeah, and this actually, I actually missed this case in my test before when I was testing it afterwards. Oh, no, I didn't. I just asserted it in a bit of a different way. So we could do this in sort of an indirect way, but we could actually do it in here. I think, let me check here. Yeah. So in here, we can actually do an assertion in our store cache query method. We could say here, expected query argument. And let me say query argument to equal, what was it? Oh, I think we're not actually passing it in. User query. So we need to pass in a user query. Did I do one of those earlier? Yeah, here we go. User query function. There's some more of that duplication we're going to need to get rid of. Expect query argument to equal user query. And then we do need to pass in query here. So now the query that the user passes in, we're confirming that that was what was passed to store cache query. We save it. It should fail. Yep. So we expected on this line to be the query argument to be user query, but it was undefined. So now this is confirming that we passed the right thing into here. Store cache query. And so now it's passing. That's now testing it out, and we're good to go. I think of one other thing that we could test as we're going through here, and that's the event, because we need to say store on transform. So if we put in some nonsense there instead, our tests are currently passing, and that's not good enough. So where can we make an assertion about that? We could do it in here. We could say expect event name to equal transform. Yeah, so expected transform is actually this. There's a big blow up here for some reason, have to do with asynchrony or something. But point is, we can say transform, and our test passes. So this is a point where it not only does it feel like we're maybe testing implementation details, like store cache query passed with the right argument. That's very implementation-y. Store on and what event name is sent, like it's implementation-y. And not only that, is like I was not really able to test drive it per se. I just found that as I was looking at my production code, I needed to put that test in there. So maybe it's really not strict test-driven development there. So is this a sign that unit testing of a component this complex is bad and we should integration test it as well? Well, as I said before, it is good and important to integration test this, and I have Cypress tests that are testing all this connected together to make sure it really works. But what I'm wanting to do here, as I said with this unit test, is to really test the contract of what's being called when, what is being passed to Orbit.js. Because when I refactor this to use React hooks, I want to make sure that store on transform is still being passed. So this is fairly complex, and maybe you wouldn't want to unit test this yourself, but it is a valid scenario to consider where you're saying the responsibility of my component is to call out to these external props and the appropriate times with the appropriate arguments passed to it, and that's what our test is now documenting here. And I think it's valuable. I think it's valuable to see with a component this crucial to our application and this complex, I think understanding the sequence of what's being called when is a valuable thing to do. So this test is now passing, where we're calling the render prop with store records. So this means that after we set the records here, the render is being rerun and those new updated records are being passed out. So we're re-rendering with the results of the store. So I think we're good. So now let's get the other tests passing. And then after that, we'll do some refactoring to remove the duplication. So there's lots of problems here. What is it? Got to scroll way up to see this problem. Store on is not a function. Cool, so for the sake of just getting things passing, let's just do this on, now it is a function. I think I should check to see which test that was. When store is ready, store on is not a function, so now it is. And now it's all passing, that's all that's needed. Cool, so our tests are passing, so now let's remove some duplication here because there's a lot going on. And I think part of what we can do is to, let's see here, store records. Store records are up here. Where are those? Maybe those are only used here. So those are only there. User query, I think, is used elsewhere. Yeah, it's there. So let's just kind of remove the duplication one at a time here. This is a lot to write, so we didn't really have a way to think in advance of exactly what was needed. Yeah, user query is duplicated, so let's move that up. It can go here because it never changes. It's just passed in at the appropriate places. Yeah, we'll rerun the test as we go to make sure everything keeps working. I think our render prop was the same everywhere we had it, so we can move that out. Although I think we probably want to redefine it each time for safety. I think there's a way to reset mocks for like what their calls are, but I think I prefer just to create a new one. So actually, I'm gonna even though that passes, to be safer, I'm gonna do this in a before each, and we're gonna do a let render prop and render prop. Every time you want to reset, you put in a before each. That should now succeed. I am going to put the let at the top for reasons that will become obvious later. All right. So let's see here. We got our store ready. Store ready is different there. So that, interesting. I wonder how I handled that. I think I might have just not. I think instead of having a fake promise that does not resolve, I just used the same store ready mechanism and just didn't resolve it. So let's move that out. Store ready promise and store ready. And this, let's move all this out. We now have all this stuff, store ready promise. So now we're just going to pass in store ready from there, and we're just not going to resolve it. Whereas here, store ready promise, then store ready promise. It's kind of scary that my linter is not running fully. I think I set something up wrong. Okay, so that all worked fine. Oh, these store records are own. Well, right here, they're only needed here. When we remove duplication in a second, I think we're going to need to do something different. Yeah. Okay, so we want to move the store out. This is our most robust version of the store, so let's move that out there. Return store records, so now that constant needs to come out here, so we'll just move the store records, even though it's only needed in one place, we'll put it out here. Transform handler is a variable that we're assigning there. So this all happens and runs. And I'm going to, I forgot this in my other test, but I am actually going to set transform handler to null and resolve store ready to null in each test, because that makes sure that we get a real good value for them. And now store, it says that it's not being used, so now we can actually use that. So I think so this is a less robust fake store, but I think our more complex store will handle it. And this store, I think our more complex one will handle it. I could be safer by just removing one of these at a time if I wanted to. Let's save and see if I totally regret this. Yeah, resolve store ready is not a function. So let's take these back and change one at a time. Resolve store ready. When store is ready. So yeah, let's see. Render query container store. Oh, store ready is not a function because I still have a store here. So let's. All right, I regret my change here, so let's just take it back. We'll undo it all, and we'll do it more safely, just one at a time. Okay, we're back to the case where the test is passing. So let's just move, this is a good example of extraction and how it can get complex. So let's move one thing out at a time. Let's move this store out and see if that works. It'll be shadowed in some of our tests, but that's okay. Now, actually, let's move the store ready out because I think that might be simpler. That store ready is there, but we can actually get a better one. That I think might have actually been working. So this is interesting because I took a big step and I had to undo. It was difficult to undo it. So let's move this store ready out. Removing duplication is hard. I think it might have been easier if I had done it at an earlier step. Okay, so that still passes. Let me find the next store ready. Okay, so that's actually all passing now. Okay, so now we can move up the store. So we're really going to do one at a time. This store is there. That should be fine because it's not shadowed. Let's move this store out and we'll just merge them together. Actually, that one's just the same, so we can probably delete that one. Although to be safe, I am going to recreate it each time. Because you really don't want mutation or tests stepping on one another. So let's recreate it each time. And that's safe. All right, so let's find the store elsewhere. So here is the more robust store. So let's go ahead and move the store records out. You know, when you get to a point where the tests are red and they keep failing, your temptation is to keep making more and more changes to fix it. But when you have a good test suite, like test-driven development gives you, it's often easier to back out, get back to a passing state, and then take smaller steps. That way you can tell at what point exactly something got broken. So let's pull this out. Actually, I'm going to pull the transform handler out just to put that variable there. See if that works. I'll set it to null in here. That's fine. Actually, I remember my resolve store ready, so let's set that to null. See if that works. It does not. All right, so let's go back to that. Let's take that transform handler out. So why would resolve store ready, setting it to null? The fact that setting it to null breaks things is scary to me because, it's probably because when I run new promise here, I think it calls my function right away. So this needs to be in the before each. So let's actually break that and then fix it. Well, actually, let's move this down here. Let store ready promise. It makes sense that that would need to be recreated. Come on, man. Store ready promise. And now if I set resolve store ready to null, it's probably a bit paranoid because this should run right away and set it, but yeah, now it works. So I like the safety of having that in there. Let's do that. Put that there, put that there. Okay. Now, and this feels a little tedious, but we are ensuring that our test code is working the way we expect and that it's not passing for incorrect reasons. So I think the safety we get from this is good. We set transform handler at the top level and clear it out. Our test still passes. So now I think we don't have any onlys, do we? No, we don't. Okay, good. All right, so now I think we're ready to move this bigger final store up here. So let's set it and let's see how things compare. Query set is fine, so that's all just the same. On is more robust. The other test just needed to be a function, but now we have some more robustness here. So that's that. And then this cache query is not needed by all the tests, but we'll put it there so the test that does need it can do its thing. So the test should still pass now because we've moved the store just out to this level. And they do pass, so great. So we have a lot of duplication that's been removed, a lot of setup here. And then in here we render, here we render, here we render. So the rendering is duplication as well. And we can pull up this one that assigns to the query by text, put that variable at the top. And we'll put this into our before each block here because we always want to render it. So after we set up these variables, we render it and get query by text. So now we don't need that before block. We don't need this render here. We just need the resolve store ready. We don't need the render here. We just need the resolve store ready act. Da 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 da. Oh, did not work. Let's see what went wrong here. Let me take it back. Save. So that's all passing. Interesting. Oh, look, there was an argument missing. That's what it was. Okay, so up here, we render. Was it store ready, store render query? So removing these incidental changes. I think we're good now. Query argument equal. No, that didn't work. Okay. Let me put it back one more time. Yeah, this is tricky. Well, glad we're taking some nice slow steps here, or going back to take some slow steps. This is already in a before each. Let me just try to gradually change things to add a query argument, even if it's just null. Oh, and then user query is available, so I can go ahead and put that there. So what? Is there anything asynchronous that needed to happen here? Before each. Let me pull this out into a before each to see if that helps. We're just removing differences between all of these. It shouldn't make any difference, but it's sometimes hard to tell with asynchrony. That's fine. That's duplicate. All right, now what if we copy and paste the query by text assignment? That shouldn't break anything, but just kind of removing differences. That. So those are all the same. That's a before each. So it would seem like if I just move this over to here, I should be fine. It seemed like that was not working though. And we do before each to keep it isolated so that every single test has the same things running before it to get a nice fresh start. No, it did pass. So yeah, so I'm not sure what I did differently there, but that's okay. I don't need to know. I just wasn't chasing red for a long period of time. I was just able to just gradually move to get there. Cool. So check it out. We have what happens in our before each. Here, the common setup, where we set up all of our wiring for the interface. We render our component. We get query by text. That's not always needed. And then we check it out. So when the store is not ready, it doesn't run the passed-in query. It calls the render prop with an empty record set, and it renders the result of the render prop, which is there. When the store is ready, it runs the passed-in query against the store. And then when that query returns, then it calls the render prop with the records from the store that have been updated. Cool, so you can see that our tests with our expectations are now super short. So it's like we can understand the setup up at the top in one place, and then the individual expectations, we can see the difference. Here where we resolve the store ready is one difference, and then we resolve the store ready and then do the transform handler. That's where the other things happen. And maybe I can come up with a better name for this, but I think this is good for now. So let's look at one time. Let's look at the interface here. One of the things about using unit testing like this, where you're using mock objects, is that it really defines the interface of what you're taking in and what you're passing out. So we can see that the user query really can be anything. And that's one thing. We can see that store ready is something that returns a promise. So there's a promise we're waiting on that we want to be able to control. We can see a render prop that's being called that's returning some JSX that we're using in some cases. Makes sense. And it suggests it's a mock function, so we can make assertions against what's passed to it. Then we have our store. So this defines what it is about the Orbit.js store that we care about. There's a store query function that is just a mock function. We don't care about what happens in there. We just want to be able to assert on what outgoing messages are sent to Orbit. There's a store cache object. It has a query function where we want to be able to check the query argument sent to it and check the store records. Now that I see this, actually, I think I would rather have this be a just function, and then down in my test, I make the assertion down there now that this is in one place. So let's change that. Store query returns expect store cache query to have been called with user query. So this, putting the assertion down here makes more sense to me now that I see it this way. This should fail because it's not a mock function. It must be a mock or spy function, and it wasn't. So let's say that this is a just function, store cache query, and then it mock return value, store records. So you don't need to use a mock function just to return something, but if you want to make assertions on it, then we do need to use it. Cool, so this should pass now. And now let's break that to make sure that assertion's happening, that the query is called with the right arguments. If we remove that, our test should fail because it's not called with the right arguments. Yeah, so down here, we expected store cache query to be called with user query, but it was called with no arguments, so now we're asserting it. Yeah, so now that I see this, now that I'm even talking through it, that's a clear way to have it. Put that down there. And for a store on, I think that it would be good to have the assertion happen elsewhere as well. But we need this functionality to happen. And I'm pretty sure Jest has a way to do that. I didn't mean to illustrate this here, but this ends up being useful. Mock implementations. It'd be useful to provide the implementation of the mock function. Jest function with a callback. All right, so let's do that. Let's say on is a jest.function. Does this make sense to do? Let's try it out and see. And then in here, we pass this implementation where we're going to remove this expectation. Transform handler. And then we'll do the mock name here, store.on. And then here, expect store.on to have been called with. And the first argument should be transform. See if that passes. Oh, so I wasn't sure about that. So just to have been called with assertion confirms the arguments that are being passed. So I could do like the argument thing, but I like the to have been called with approach. So let's check that out and see how we can do that. Custom matchers. I want to be able to say any function, which I think you can do. I think it's in the API. Let's search for any. Expect anything. Here we go. Expect any constructor. I'm not sure if I could say any function. I can say expect anything because if it's not a function, it's going to blow up later. So I think that's fine for now. I might clean that up offline. Cool. So now we're confirming that that was called the right way down there. And if this was changed again, we'll make sure the test broken. You can see here, although I was planning on demoing TDD, I was writing some test after as we went. But as I did, I was making sure to break the test afterwards so we saw it to be read. Cool. And so we see that this is being broken. So now if we put in transform, it's going to make it pass. Cool. So let's review our test again. So I think our setup here is probably cleaner. As we look at our store, query is a mock function. Cache query is a mock function that returns the store records. And on is a mock function that saves the handler for us to control later. And we see as we look down here for this scenario, the scenario that has the full functionality of when everything is done and gotten back from Orbit, we say after we do our rendering or initial setup, we get the store to be ready. and then we run the transform handler that was sent to Orbit. This is simulating a transform happening. So this is when Orbit calls back to us to let us know that a transform event happened. When that happens, we are going to wait for that store ready promise as well. Although interestingly, we maybe could do these expectations up here and then just return the store ready promise. But anyways, we'll keep it this way. So we're confirming that store on was called with the right event, that it was the transform event, not something else. We are confirming that the cache query was called with the right user query sent to it so that the right data is retrieved from the cache. And then we expected that those store records were passed to the render prop properly. And with that, we're good. We have test driven out our functionality. So let's run our Cypress test again to make sure it's actually still working. I think, was there a difference? Store on. Actually, I didn't end up putting the transform in the place that I thought. So actually, let's do that change first. Let's turn this into a block first and make sure that that test still passes. And now let's put the store on transform in here, because it makes sense that we wouldn't set that up until the store is ready. That just feels more like a proper way to do it. Oh, so that is not okay. Okay, so now transform handler is not ready at the right time. So that's okay. Let's move that down here. We resolve the store is ready, and then when the store ready promise is done, then we act down here. And I think that's okay. Cool, that makes sense. Cool, so we now have actually slightly different functionality than we did in production, where we say, oh, once the store is ready, then we set up this event listener, and we run the query here. Yeah, so let's run our Cypress test to make sure that things are good. No, kind of read property map of undefined. Interesting. I have broken things. Maybe I should have been running this as I went. Maybe a console will give me more details. To-do list component. To-do container line 25. So this is other code. Render records, was it the name of the argument? Yeah, check it out. So this is why it's useful to test an integration. So I forgot that for a render prop, well, actually, no, this isn't necessary for that. But here, I gave it as a named argument, and that was just useful in case you need to pass other things to the render prop in the future. So I'm going to change that. I'm going to say, yeah, so let's change the test to go back and match this. Render prop to have been called with records, empty array. And then where's the other render prop to be called with records, store records. So that's now the interface that the component had before. It should fail because our new code does not do that. And so now we'll just do this. There, now that's passing, and let's retry Cypress and hope that I haven't messed up my stream. Yeah, it's now all connected. So we've now taken this code that we spiked on and we re-implemented it from scratch driven by tests. That way we're sure that all of this functionality is covered by our tests. We also didn't add the tests after the fact. On a lot of code, you might think that you can do that just fine, but this was so complex, I just didn't trust myself to add the tests after the fact. I wanted to test drive it to make sure that I knew that we were fully covered. And as we did, it turns out that the test that I wrote is actually better and clearer by having to explain it here on the stream. And so that's the value of that pairing, is that we kind of get some extra clarity there. So that's a way that you could get a unit test in and test drive a complex component like this that had a lot of interaction with other external third-party code. It shows the value of kind of showing the external interface that we're calling out using the appropriate things at the appropriate times. And this is going to prepare me for my refactor when I refactor this to extract a custom React hook out of this query container component to the point that I won't ultimately need the query container at all. But that refactor is going to cover that. Maybe I'll do a stream on that extraction. I'm not sure yet. But we've been going on for long enough, so I'll call it to a close here. In the description for this video, I'll do a link to the project that this lives in, as well as the PR that this was in. I'll have a PR that has this new additional test in it, so you can take a look at the code a bit more. But thanks for joining in. I hope this was useful to think through kind of some challenging unit testing and test driving. Thanks so much.